Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Alright, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Bitter, and I want to welcome everyone to this episode of the show. As a way to thank the listeners for helping me grow this podcast over the years, I'm going to continue a raffle option for all of you to have a chance to win a free consultation with me. So it's a 30-minute consultation that I will raffle off once per month. All you have to do to enter is share the episodes that you enjoy on whatever platform you find most interesting. The only thing I ask you to do is, if it's a social media channel, make sure you tag me so I see it and can save that and enter in the raffle. Or if it's somewhere else that you can't tag me at, take a screenshot and send that to me at hpopodcast@gmail.com. You can also enter the raffle by writing a show review on your favorite podcast listening platform. So if you do that, take the screenshot, send it to hpopodcast@gmail.com, and I will enter you in that monthly raffle. Also, I'm excited to announce that I launched a new group coaching option. So to go along with my personalized one-on-one coaching options and my pre-made plans that I have on my website at zachbitter.com, this year I'm starting a group of online endurance runners who want to work with me in a slightly different model. So this model is set up so that whether you're a beginner or advanced, you can join. Whether you're training for something like a 5K or something as far as a 200 plus miler, you are welcome, and this setup will help you reach your goals. The way I have it set up is, if you subscribe, you will have access to my full catalog of training plans, which range from beginner 5K all the way up to advanced 200 plus miles. Along with that plan that you're going to use, you will have access to a weekly group meeting where you can ask questions about training. You can ask about adjustments to the plan to make it more personalized to you. You can engage with the other group members if you want. We'll get you all set up and ready to really personalize that plan to make sure that you're heading in the right direction for your event. Also, you will have access to office hours, where if you have something you want to ask and you want to just hop in and ask a question, you'll be given access to that as well. I will be bringing in guest speakers who have a deep understanding of specific topics and things that we'll use to better your training and recovery process throughout the course of the year, as well as a private forum for all the members to engage with one another, share stories, share training tips, and just house a lot of the information that we'll go over on the daily and weekly basis as you're pursuing your race goals. So if you're interested in checking that out, just head to my website at zachbitter.com, go to the coaching tab. From there, you'll be directed to the team coaching option, and you can sign up for that and get onboarded to join the group. If you're interested in keeping up with what I'm up to, please give me a follow on some of my socials. Follow me on Instagram at ZachBitter, on X, Twitter at ZBitter, and check out the brand new HPO podcast handles, which are just at HPO Podcast on Instagram and X/Twitter. Of course, all this stuff can be found quite easily on my website, which is the main landing page for everything I do at zachbitter.com. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off, and Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you. Links and details can be found in the show notes and the episode landing page. You can also check out a full description of how I use all of these products in my own training and racing at the end of this podcast episode.
Dude, thanks again for this, man. Like I was really honored you reached out and thought of me, and dude, also great to catch up, man. Like how have you been?
Good. Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. First of all, I think it'll be fun to kind of introduce some just more like current events type topic-based stuff around the ultra running and things like that. So I think those sort of things are just better done with co-hosts than they are just
Yes.
kind of soloing it. And
Mhm.
I know like you are just very, very like tuned in to the ultra world. So thought who better to ask?
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and it's super cool, man. I'm stoked to chat about this because I feel like there's always so much going on in the space now, and I think it's like a cool and needed topic. And yeah, I'm happy to give a shout out to this on my pod and share it on all the platforms and stuff. And so it's really cool. Like a lot of people who reach out and listen to my pod listen to your pod too. So it's super cool to, and then like it's growing and growing, and so anything I can do to try and supplement a lot of the listeners' ears and stuff, I'm happy to promote this like as much as I can. So yeah, man, this is awesome.
Right on. No, it'll be fun. And I think like another reason why you'll be an interesting perspective, I think, is because you're quickly collecting the ultra running affinity stones. And like with finishing Cocodona, I guess Cocodona is that 2 or 3 weeks ago at the 3 weeks ago at this point. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I definitely want to spend the majority of this episode just chatting to you about that and just kind of get your takeaway from that because I imagine uh doing a race of that duration and that magnitude had to given you at least some new perspectives on the sport. I just recently recorded an episode that went up today as we're recording this one. So once this goes up, it'll have been up for a few days, I'm sure. But it was just as like kind of my experience coaching for it because I had a couple clients. I had clients in all three of the events there, and two in the 250, three in the 125, and one in the 38. So it just made sense to go there and kind of check it out, see it from start to finish, and just try to learn like what are some things that maybe stand out about this type of an event versus what I think the historic kind of target marks for ultra marathons have been and make sure that I'm staying up to speed as a coach too. But you coach, you run, you record podcasts, and you did it. So you have an even deeper experience of it. So I'd love to hear kind of what your thoughts were about the Cocodona 250.
Yeah, for sure, man. And are we rolling, by the way? Is this like, are
Yeah,
we just
yeah.
in it? Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just making sure. But yeah, I
Sorry, I
think
should have told you you're not
no, you're
recording.
good. No, you're good. But yeah, and it was so cool to like experience it. And like, but I also think too, like even before I did the thing, like I also crewed and paced. So like it's such like I feel like it's such a good experience to get that first crew and pace experience. And which is interesting for you because you not only had the 250, but you had the 125 and the 38, which are all completely different races. So you kind of get
Mhm.
this like spectrum of what are the different individuality kind of specific things that you do differently on there. And like obviously like you've been coaching for a long time, you've been in the sport for a long time, so like you can see those things. But like I'm curious of like what that kind of looks like from each of those angles, like seeing it all like in the span of that same week, right? Because you can, I think like the biggest takeaway from me, like from going from these two like 100s to 200s, which like that is like kind of like the next level now, but it's still like at least double the distance if you're doing a 200, and then 2.5 if you're doing the 250. But there's such like a big jump between the two. Like I think on paper like you see the mileage, but like being in it like really just takes it to the next level like in terms of that stuff. And I think what's super interesting is when you see things like Cocodona selling out in a matter of 2 weeks, whereas historically, I mean, basically this year it did sell out, but what people don't know is it kind of had like a forced sellout because they had the permitting thing kind of come up with like endangered owls in the area, and they had to like basically cut off registration early, and they still had like some extra spots that like they had to kind of encourage people to say, hey, like you might need to defer just due to like all that stuff. But to see it go from potentially not selling out to selling out in 2 weeks over the course of the year, I think it's just showing that number one, this sport's becoming more accessible. Number two, like the impact of media and like just how exposing it to the world can like get people stoked about it. And then number three, I think it just goes back to the inherent reason why everyone does ultras. It's like people are just asking what's that next limit. Like 100 milers now in the ultra marathon space, it's like running a marathon back in like the olden days of when like running was getting popular, right? So it's just interesting to see. I'm curious for you though, and I'm happy to share my takeaways, but like as a coach on your end, like and being, because was that your first time like crewing and kind of being with like on like the boots on the ground for like a 200 or?
Not the first time. I was actually out at the inaugural Cocodona doing
Oh,
a little
nice.
bit of pacing and a very little amount of crewing for Maggie Guterall. So
Oh, nice.
I did see I saw like I'll actually reflect on that because that got me kind of interested in it because one thing that was really interesting to me with that particular year was Nicole was also pacing. So she had
Hmm.
like a section and then I was going to follow up that section. And, Nicole drew, I guess, what you would maybe consider the short straw of the pacing duties, where she got Maggie what ultimately ended up being the lowest point for her during that
Mhm.
race. I mean, Maggie won it that year, so she had a good
Mhm.
race, but like that was like her lowest point of the 250-mile stretch. And um so like she's coming into the aid station where I'm gonna pick her up and start pacing a fair bit behind where we had projected when Nicole started. So I'm thinking at this point, okay, it's starting to get to be dusk. I'm like, okay, based on how fast she's moving now, I should probably plan on going through the night with her for this like roughly 20-mile stretch. So I'm kind of getting myself like, mentally and physically prepared to be up all night and be out there, helping her get to that next spot. And she comes in and does like this maybe 15, 20-minute reset, just like eat some food, get some fluids, and takes a quick nap. It kind of cleans up a little bit, brushes her teeth, does the whole Courtney Dauwalter routine. and and she like was like brand new after that. She ended up running like really quick to the point where like I ended up my projection of when she would finish that section to when she did was like a few hours quicker.
Mhm.
So that gave me my kind of my first perspective of like how quickly things can turn around and how much of a ebb and flow you have that just has that kind of like extended roller coaster of that when you get into these really long ones when you're dealing with sleep deprivation, multiple nights. Uh, this is something I think we should talk about too, is just processing limits. Because I think like
Yes.
as we get more competitive pressure in these longer events, we're going to start recognizing, just like you do with the, you watch any of the Olympics, you'll start to notice like when you get to you get that much competitive pressure, you start recognizing like, oh, different sports sort of produces like roughly different types of physiques, different types of strengths. And when a huge chunk of the world is exposed to it, you just end up getting the best with all the like skewed assets or strengths towards what would make them good at that. And I always wonder with like some of these really long things, like something as simple as like, let's say fluid processing, you're
Mhm.
someone who can process 1.25 liters per hour versus someone who can process 1.5 liters per hour or something like that. All things else held equal, which wouldn't actually happen, but let's just imagine that. When you have a race like Cocodona or even the Sedona 125 to some degree, because that one starts out early, you don't see your crew until after
Mhm.
50K, you're just if you're someone who has like a low processing limit and you're a heavy sweater on top of it, I just don't know what your path forward is other than just taking a hit in that early stage and think, okay, I'm going to get to Crown King and I'm going to be like pretty depleted no matter what I do. So I just need to kind of survive that section, kind of regroup and then get into the spots where I can maybe lean into my strengths a little bit and just hope that that gap that you create between you and the people that you think you should be running with because of that maybe have a better strength on processing limits and stuff like that, uh, have a weakness somewhere else where you can kind of catch up. But like anything, if we get enough competitive pressure, you'll see people with strengths on all of those skill sets towards being out there for 2, 3 days and being able to essentially survive better.
Yeah, for sure. And I like how you kind of mentioned that because it really is such a chess game with these 200s, right? Like, and with any 100 or any ultra in general, it's so important to know the course. But I think there, like, that value probably gets 5x, 10x when you're racing a 200-mile race. Like, if you want to do the best that you can, just because, especially like with a race like Cocodona, and even if you think about some of the other 200s, like Moab 240, or I mean, even Bigfoot, like, gets pretty varied in terrain and weather and all this kind of stuff as well. It's like you need to know that course to like play those chess pieces in the right way. And I think for me that was, and I lived in Arizona, and I've seen probably like 90% of the course beforehand, but like I didn't anticipate like how I would feel at certain points. And like it's one of those things where it's like, okay, maybe I want to go into this section a little bit more sleep deprived, because like even if I'm fresh, I'm not as good at like this technical downhill stuff. But that way, when I'm more fresh to go on some of these dirt road sections where I can kind of rip it, like I can really gain some miles. Whereas like if you're in a 100 miler, like generally you kind of gotta you kind of got to like be the best you can for 100 miles, whereas like 250, like you can be crappy in some sections and like be totally okay. And not saying you can't do that in 100, but like I think the margin of error is so much greater in those 100 milers, like because like you can't be crappy for too long, whereas like a 250 you can be. I mean, Arlen Glick's a great example. I was talking with him. He was saying day one it was great, day two he was feeling terrible, and then day three he just turned around at a rock star day. And like if you look at some of his splits, I mean, I think he was climbing up Kasner like very slow, up in Sedona, which is like the midway point, like a little over the midway point, and had just this incredible third day. Whereas like if you look at that second day from like a scope of 100 miler, you're like, man, is he going to come back? And, he came back like crazy and ended up getting the podium. So I think it just that knowing the course is like, that was like my biggest kind of takeaway. And not just knowing the course in terms of like what the terrain is, but like how you're going to be in sleep and stuff like that. And I think, it's one of those things that you don't kind of get until you're in it. And I think, and even so, like I'm starting to coach athletes in 200s, and I know you're coaching them 200s. It's like, I think people who haven't done a 200 kind of have like a little bit of a, like, I don't want to say a little bit, like a lot of a disadvantage is just because you don't know what your body's going to be like in that sleep deprived state. And like everybody has these different sleep strategies. And I think it's like one of those things that even if it kind of goes south, you learn. And like, that's like the cool thing about the 200s is like the only way that you're really going to know is if you're in there. And yes, of course, the argument can be made for 100 miles and 50K, but it's just like, a lot of those conditions you can kind of recreate in training to some extent, whereas like 200 miles, it's really tough to. So I like to see like anyone's first 200 miler as like a guinea pig experiment for like what your body can handle and do. And I think, it's just so exciting to see a lot of people kind of get into that kind of mode and mindset, which is super cool. Like, how do you, and I'm curious for you because like, the sports just changed like crazy, right? And like you talk about like the competitive pressures coming in. The thing that blew my mind was like the prior course record of this was Mike's, and he had the greatest, in my eyes, greatest comeback in ultramarathon history at 69 hours. And this year, that course record was 59 with basically the top five all coming like under. I think it was like all the top five coming under course record, which is unbelievable. So being with Maggie that first year versus being on the course this year, like what changes have you kind of noticed from that like first inception to like kind of this year and maybe just seeing some different kind of shifts like from that 4 year span?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I would say like there's probably a few ways to look at it. One is being an inaugural year is always going to be complicated because there's just going to be like mistakes, if you want to call them that, that the race organization is going to have to
Mm,
be tolerant, or the participants are going to have to be tolerant of, because we're all kind of learning on the fly to some degree. It's like there's no reason to believe that Jamil and Airvipe are going to be put together a 250-mile course with zero issues on his very first year. That first year, to some degree, draws the blueprint of like where are the holes in this and what do we need to do to make this a better experience for the participants. And that first year, I think it was just that first section was stood
mm,
out as like, okay, we have like this section where we don't have great access to aid stations, and you have this really long stretch to the hottest part of the race where like I don't know that you can really bring enough water realistically. I know they have like a 4 liter requirement, and a lot of the people I talked to, including some of my coaching clients, were carrying 6 liters in that first section. So it's like, you have like a scenario like that where on the first year that was probably a lot worse for people because nobody knew and
mm,
couldn't necessarily prepare properly for it. Whereas now everyone kind of knows like that is going to be a very, very like pointed spot. And the race organization has also refined that to some degree to be able to make that a little less of a problem area. Although I guess this year from what I heard, someone like stole a bunch of the water
yeah.
from the water drop, and then
Mm,
people were getting like their ration from that aid station. So, I mean, you're gonna have, so in terms of things that maybe remained there from the beginning to now, still is there's gonna be a certain level of uncontrollables that you just cannot
mm,
worry about before, and you're just going to have to absorb as you get to them. And that would be one of them. You can't predict or plan for like, oh, well, I'm just assume at mile 20 the water station's going to get hacked and we're going to get half our ration. You maybe think like, what would I do if I found myself in a situation where I was low on fluids, and kind of have strategies for that, which is probably good practice. Um, but to answer your question more directly, I would say like those sort of planning things are getting a little more precise, where people are starting to recognize like there's going to be uncertainties, but they're refining their kind of deck of options in terms of what to
mm,
do when they find them themselves. So it's less of a like, okay, I'm in a rough spot, just throwing stuff up against the wall. It's like I'm in a rough situation. Here are the 2 or 3 realistic things I can do here, and I just need to pick the best out of those. So from a cognitive standpoint, you can probably like move from one step to the next a little easier without like trying to rack your brain on the fly as much as you maybe would have had to in those inaugural year type scenarios. Um, yeah, so I would say like the big thing though is probably the competitive pressure. It's like we've been talking about here, where you just looked at the entrance list to start this year and you just knew like this was going to be the fastest year.
Mm,
and then you get slightly cooler temps this year at the start than you'd had in the prior years, then that just sets it up for like you're going to have someone's going under the course record probably substantially, and then as it ends up playing out, you have multiple people do it. So that's probably the biggest one is just you get a scenario where you don't have a 10-hour lead or something like that. Then or even just like the idea where like if you fall behind by a certain amount of time, you probably can't expect to catch up the way you'd maybe be able to the way Mike did
mm,
the year he did. I think those years are probably going to be a lot harder to find. And that's similar to what we've seen in the 100 mile where like in the past you could have a really rough patch and then you had this glimmer of hope still. Whereas now when you get these really competitive 100 milers, there's a certain point where like if you make a big enough mistake, you can pretty much rest assured there's going to be some people that don't make a big enough mistake where now all of a sudden you have a gap that's unclosable because we just have more data. So we're probably moving that direction with the 250s, but there's still a long ways to go.
yeah, for sure. And that's such a good point, like just that competitive pressure. Because I was chatting with Sarah Ostazuski yesterday, who's the
Yeah.
female course record holder, and I was telling, and we were just kind of talking about it. I was like, I don't think there's any way someone could have ran 59 without the field that was out there. Like,
Hmm.
I think that is what drove such the high numbers. Because generally, like if you look at a lot of these other 200s, they maybe have, 6, 7 guys who are like super competitive that year. I mean, like this year, could have probably been like 20 of those guys who could have won that race, like, which is just wild. And I mean, it was very thick and like, pretty close for like most of the race. I had like my team just kind of updating it and people were pretty close throughout, like within like a 3 to 5 mile difference with like, which in like 100 mile, that's like, wow, that's a big gap. But a 200 mile, that's
The
like
nap.
neck basically. And so I think when you have that pressure kind of going on, it's great. But I also just think it's like the distribution of information, right? Like you have a lot of guys, and if you think about like the top field too, Jeff, Joe McConaughey, like those guys, they're also coaches, like they're also like sharing this information, like sharing content on stuff like that. Like I think when 200 miles kind of broke popularity, which I would probably argue is like when Courtney and David Goggins and Cam Hanes kind of like made it a little bit more mainstream. Even at that point, it was still kind of like a black box. Like no one really knew. There's not really too many studies on it. It's just like, how the heck do you put this thing together? And like, I would argue for the past 3 years, it was kind of like that as well. Like one of my favorite quotes that I heard about 200-mile training comes from Joe McConaughey, and he was saying like, marathon's like a science, right? You got it down to a science. The distance is controlled. The terrain pretty much barely varies from race to race. Like you can kind of know what you're doing there. 100 miles is more like an art, right? The terrain's different. You kind of, but like there's basic principles that are like really generalized across the distance. And then training for a 200 plus miles, like black voodoo magic. Like there's just like a bunch of different things all around. And I was like, that's such a good point because it seemed very just idiosyncratic to the person. But I think now, as we're seeing like better performances, more athletes in the space, and like even just like the live stream and people doing more podcast content and sharing their experiences, like and even just from your perspective too, like, working with athletes, like, as a coach, like, this too. It's like you learn so much just from seeing like your athletes and hearing their experience and all that stuff. I think like now it's just becoming much more of a thing where I think, in a matter of 3, 4 years, like we could have like really best practices around 250s where it's like we know how to like, write a pretty good principled training plan. Whereas I think before it just seemed like to me, in my perception, it was like everyone kind of trains for this stuff different. I mean, like you see people low volume, you see people incredibly high volume, you see people plan their sleep. You see people who just wing it out
Yeah.
there. And like, I think now we're starting to get more best practice stuff, which I mean, that's what happened with the 100 miler, right? And that's why it's gotten so fast. And I think, the 200s, like it's going to be there too. And then now you got the 300s coming out. So it's evolving, which is just so awesome to see. And like, I think, Cocodona like has like a very good opportunity to be like the Western States of 200s and like just be this super competitive event. And like, I think what was before is just seen as like a physical and mental challenge. It's like now this is a competitive distance. Like this is going to be some of where the best athletes come out. I mean, even just look at some of the entrance lists for next year. Like Leah Yingling signed up, like, which is just incredible to see. And
Yeah.
I think you're going to start to see like Arlen popping in was a cool thing to see. You're going to start to, I think, see a lot of these 100-mile specialists like kind of come into the sport because like I think now like it's like okay it's so much easier to get a grip on even just from general population, right? I think that's why you see the race sell out so quickly is like because people see this and like, oh, I think I can do this thing, right? Because there's
Mhm.
just so like, and I think that just shows the power of information and just how well it gets distributed. And just hats off to Aravaipa for like making this race so accessible through the live stream. Like, I think that's like the cool thing that just shows like how accessible ultra running can be, like when you like have abundant information to kind of dive into, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, one thing you said a few things I want to ask you about from your perception
Mm,
or perspective when you're out there was I was talking to Jeff Browning a bit about this afterwards. I actually was able to talk with him a little bit after the race. He had some time to actually kind of think about it after his experience and all his coaching clients' experience was just like the sleep side of things.
yeah.
So I think it's interesting because I think like when you start getting up into like distances beyond a day and closer to 48 hours plus, it's not really a question anymore of if you're going to likely get some value from a nap, whether it's a really, really short one, like a micro nap of like a few minutes, or, something a little more substantial, like a full sleep cycle of 60 to 90 minutes. But I think like it becomes less of a question of if, but a question of when and how to structure that. Did you
Yes.
see anything specific about your experience that would lean you one way or the other with kind of how you'd go about that?
Yeah, this was an interesting one because it's a great question. And I think, like, I'm sure you as a coach, like, also, it's like the most common question I think about 200 miles, like, what do I do about sleep? And last year, like, when I wasn't racing, I had more time and I was like interviewing tons of people doing the race. And like, I interviewed, like, front of the Packers, mid Packers, back of the Packers. And the common question I asked is, like, what was your sleep strategy? And generally, like,
Yeah.
and you do a great job in this in your podcast too. It's like, you interview high performers or even just even just anyone who's successful in like their own right, and you try to find principles to like see like, okay, like success leaves clues, what can be the thing. So I'm asking all these questions about sleep, and to my surprise, pretty much every single person had a different answer. like some people are like, I'm playing my sleep. Some people are like, I sleep whenever. Some people are like, I just try to go as much sleep as possible. So it's a very, like, to me, like my kind of vibe was that was like a very idiosyncratic thing. And it's like, that's one of those things you don't know when you know. But I think as a first time a 200 miler, I don't think it's like something that you should just like wing. Like, so the way that I kind of approached it is because and this is kind of like what I like to talk with my clients about. It's like the sleep deprivation kind of hits everybody differently in terms of like different points, how you handle with it, like how cognitively kind of like aware you are and stuff. But I think a good rule of thumb that I followed and I think is good to follow is like, don't, like, you always want to be lucid. Yes, you might be like exhausted, you might be tired, you might be like a little out of it, but like you don't want to kind of be in this like, zombie mode where you're like, you're going 30-minute mile on flat ground and just kind of like out of it. Like, you want to be able to at least be lucid at some point. And the problem is like where, and I even experienced this firsthand, it's like sometimes you can like push the dial too far on sleep and you kind of get into this mode where like not only are you moving slow, but now you got to take more time to give yourself a bigger reset to kind of get back to it. Whereas like a 10-minute, 20-minute nap like won't do it. So before the race, to hedge my bets, what I did was I actually planned my sleep for the first 2 days. And that way, like, I didn't want to be in a scenario where I kind of try to find the limits on sleep and almost like overcorrect it so much that like now I'm just screwed for the rest of the race. Cause I mean, you see that all the time. People screw up their sleep and just have a terrible race after that because they just can't pull it together. So for me to hedge that bet, I said, okay, first night I'm going to sleep 20 minutes. And the way that I kind of made a sliding strategy on that was like depending on how I felt. So first night I said, okay, I'm going to do 20 minutes either at Whiskey Row or Iron King, and that's going to depend on like how I'm feeling. If I come to Whiskey tired, I'll take a nap. If I'm like pretty jacked up and excited, I'll go and sleep at Iron King. But that way, I'm like getting the sleep ahead, so I can not like reduce the downside of potentially pushing too far. And then the second night, similar thing. I said, hey, I'm either going to sleep at Jerome or I'm going to sleep at Dead Horse, depending on how I'm feeling. And then what I plan to do, like those were two 20-minute naps. And then I was planning to do a bigger sleep at Sedona as kind of like just like a big mental reset. And that would range anywhere between 70 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how I felt. The longer the sleep, the crappier I felt. And then basically after that, it was only going to be when I'm super tired, dirt naps, and ad hoc naps. And so basically, you kind of got to play this game where it's like, I don't know what I'm going to do, but let me hedge my bets by just placing in these things. What I kind of found in the execution was really interesting. Like, I would sleep, but like I felt like I didn't need it. I
Hmm.
almost got very nervous about pushing too far that like I would almost use it as a crutch, meaning like I found myself like feeling like starting to get the early onset symptoms of it and then just be like, oh, I might need to sleep. So then I would take like a 20-minute nap or a dirt nap or stuff. And I think like that I think I slept too much. Like I was, yes, I was tired. Like, yes, I was exhausted. But like on the last day, I was kind of not over it at that point, but like I really wanted to be done. And I told my crew, I was like, I don't want to sleep anymore. And I was very sleep deprived, but I still like moved and I still like had all this stuff like efficiently. And I was like, wow, like I probably could have pushed a little bit further, like with a little bit more sleep. So to wrap this kind of long answer up, like my kind of conclusion of all this is saying like I think I would probably serve from being more of a person that just like sleeps when you feel like it. So Mike McKnight does that strategy. Like that's kind of his kind of game. He's like, because if he plans sleep, he kind of has his mind kind of going and stuff. For me, it just like I don't know. Like I feel like I felt like I could have pushed a little bit more based on that last day. And I think the interesting thing too is like for me, I did not sleep more than 25 minutes at any point because after 25 minutes, my legs would cramp up so bad that like
Oh.
I could not like I had to wake up because it was just so bad. So, but still, even with just 20-minute naps, I got just under 3 hours of sleep. So like I was a lot of stoppage, a lot of like, let me just take a nap and blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, but I think it's like one of those things where you kind of learn in the fire. How did you, like, I'm curious, like you had, several athletes, like, did they approach sleep differently? Like, I guess what was that kind of like, do you see it like being very different per person or curious to hear your thoughts?
Yeah, this is kind of where I'm falling now, and your perspective is really interesting to me. I think like the biggest fear I have as a coach, and I think as I would have if I were running it myself, and a lot of my clients had was, what if I plan an opportunity to sleep at like a good spot? Because there's better spots and worse spots to try to take a nap. Like obviously, like the side of a trail is probably less preferred than, oh, I'm at this major aid station and my crew has an RV and I have an actual bed to lay down in, or let's say you're not even being crewed, you're going Andy Glaze style, doing it all on your own, and you get to a major aid station and they have cots there that you can sleep in if you want to, like sleeping spots. They had those on the course. So the way I looked at it was like, let's play the odds as best we can
Mm,
and put together some scaffolding, but know that like this is something where if if you don't think you're going to fall asleep, we need to pivot to the next piece or the next
mm,
option versus trying to force it so that you don't find yourself in a situation where we have you lay down for 30 minutes, you just lay there restlessly, and then you get up feeling like you just wasted time and got no sleep. So we just started thinking about it as like, okay, what is the most likely times that you're going to feel the sleep pressure come on? And
mm,
it's likely going to be at night. So we're thinking those are going to be like the higher pressure areas. And then based on where you're going to be on the course most likely during that time frame, can we anticipate like a higher likelihood chance of you sleeping in one of these areas or taking a nap in one of these areas? And then from there, it was just kind of like learning I think the individual part is how you actually respond to that. Because
yes.
there was a variance. I had a coaching client who took a 90 plus minute nap. And then I had another one that, was, more like Mike in the sense that there's just like 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, that sort of thing. So I think that's maybe something if you don't have any experience, you have to kind of learn about yourself on the fly a
Hmm.
little bit and then adjust the plan accordingly if you see something presenting itself as more likely to be the case. Um, but yeah, I think like sleeping, one of the things that I think is I'm leaning more heavily towards now is like sleeping a little earlier than what I think most people assume you should isn't a bad idea,
Mm,
especially on a course like Cocodona where you're gonna hit that real hard stretch right out the gate in the beginning. So I just assume everyone's getting the Crown King behind where they would like to be in optimal scenarios just because of the logistics of it all. And I don't know there's a great way around it. So that tells me like you might find an opportunity to rest and let things kind of settle and catch up a little sooner than you would on, say, a 200 or 250-mile race where the first, 50K to 60K is just like an easier part of the course or a smoother,
hmm.
more supported area of the course and things like that. So yeah, but I mean, in terms of just like, I think the universal principle I think is like some scaffolding is great in terms of like let's try to predict like you're
Mm,
probably more likely to be tired at 2 p.m. or I'm sorry, at 2 a.m. than 2 p.m. So like if we assume you're going to be coming through a major aid station at 2 p.m., maybe we don't necessarily think, okay, we got to try to really encourage you to take a nap if you're feeling like it versus you coming through a major aid station at 2 a.m. We can assume like there's a good chance that you're probably tired enough. And then the other thing I was got interested in is just like caffeine usage. So
mm,
if it's a scenario where it's like, let's say it's 10 p.m., I'm roughly 4 hours out of a major aid station, and I'm starting to get a little tired. but it's not really impacting my forward progress. It's just a little bit annoying. I'm like, I'm maybe staying away from caffeine those last few hours. So when I do get into that aid station, I could actually like stand a better chance
Hmm.
to not have myself in a situation where I'm really, really tired, but still wired from the caffeine. And I lay down and it was like, oh, 20, 30 minutes later, I'm up like without any sleep. So some stuff like that too, just kind of trying to planning that. But ultimately, like if you're crude, I just have it like set up like the one of the benefits of having kind of that scaffolding there is then they're prepared for that. So you
Yes.
come in and they can check on you within seconds probably as to like whether the fatigue is such that a nap is going to be a good direction to go for sure, or if there's some subjectivity to it. And if they're prepared and ready, they can get you into that sleeping position really quick and just save a lot of time. Because I think the disadvantage to shorter, more frequent is there's the setup and the takedown. It's like
Yes.
camping, right? Like you got to pop the tent up, you got to take it back down again, kind of a thing. So, but if your crew is tuned into like the likelihood scenario, in certain spots, they'll have all that prepared for you and they'll know to have it ready so you can kind of transition in and out of that nap really quickly versus feeling like you got to do it on the fly as much. Um, the other thing that I'm usually like fairly convinced on at the moment is duration does matter to some degree in terms of how impactful that nap is going to be. Where, especially when you get later on, so if someone is feeling sleep pressure and they lay down and they take like a few minutes, like a 5 minute nap, they're probably going to feel that's probably going to help remove some of that sleep pressure,
Hmm.
but it's going to catch back up to them quicker than if they hit like a 20/30 or a 60/90. So I think looking at the sleep duration as like how it's kind of similar to like caffeine dosage. Like if you take 30 milligrams of caffeine versus 70 milligrams versus 150 milligrams, it's like you're going to kind of get different experiences with that or different lengths of like impact from that. Same thing kind of with the sleep, where like if you're on the trail and you're a couple hours out from an aid station, 2 to 5 minute power nap on the side of the trail might remove the sleep pressure enough to keep you moving enough to get there versus a scenario where like you're in an aid station and by sleeping for a little bit longer you're going to remove that sleep pressure for a longer stretch, and if you're not going to see your crew again for another in some cases on a course like handful plus hours, then maybe that's
Hmm.
the better time to do that if you can, if you have all options available to you. Because sometimes it's something where it's like if you lay down, I could easily sleep for 90 minutes, but I could also have my crew wake me up in 15. So
Yeah.
I think kind of knowing what's coming up next and where all the like the points of interest are really interesting with that topic.
Yeah, for sure. And you made a good point about like the setup and the stoppage time, because I think like that is one of the biggest things in 200 is not just the setup and the stoppage time, but just like the non-moving time. Like I know like someone who's like one of my friends, like if you look at his splits versus some of the winning times, like in the second year of Cocodona, it was the faster course. He had a very similar moving time to a lot of like the people who are top at the front, but he came significantly lower because he had such like a huge like time at aid stations and sleep and things like that too. And it's like, yeah, in a vacuum, like those 5 extra minutes that you take to like set up and break down, and like even sometimes like I remember getting up from some of those naps, you kind of got to like mentally like, okay, like let me just get my bearings, like maybe eat something on there, like that all adds up, like it does, like
Yeah.
like 5 minutes, like it does. Like you do that, like, let's just say you're napping 10 times versus five, and like you take that 5 minute difference on there, like that's, an extra, 100 minutes that you're potentially like throwing away, which is kind of crazy. So it's like you gotta like, even though like it's kind of just an interesting conundrum because like you don't want to rush into 200. You have like time to like take care of yourself, and like you gotta like, I think one of the biggest tips that I got was from Sarah, because I was chatting a lot with her, and she was like, at Crown King, like you just go through a really tough section. You need to just take care of yourself and like make
Mhm.
sure you're set up for success. And like that was kind of like my big thing was like, don't rush, take care of yourself. But it's like you also gotta like balance the pendulum of like you don't want to waste too much time out there. So from a sleep perspective, to kind of bring it back to your point, is like you also got to be efficient of that kind of stuff too. Because if you take that 5 minute nap, and I agree with you, like I took any naps anywhere between 5 to 20 minutes, and by far the least effective one was like 5 minutes. Like I would do 5 minutes, and I would feel good for maybe 2 miles, and then like I'd feel like I have to go again, and then I would be like,
Yeah.
all right, well let me do 10 minutes, and like that worked, and I'm like, well damn, like if I just did one 15-minute shot, it probably would have been a little easier. So I think it's like all those things to tinker about. And I think that's like, if you really want to perform your very best, I'm not saying it's a requirement, but like the crew, like getting them dialed in is just like it is like I like to say like my crew helped me to shave off like probably 10 hours of my time just from like even just the thinking because like your
Hmm.
brain's kind of out the window that last day, at least for me. Like I just it was hard for me to just like kind of think about things, and like your like crew kind of acts as like your brain, which I mean like shout out to Andy Glazes, anyone who does this stuff unsupported, because I think it is just like I mean I, I just think about like all this stuff I lean on my crew for, and it's wild. So I think like that the logistical side of things in a 200 is, I don't want to say just as important because you do need to go the distance physically, but I mean if you want to like do the best that you can, you got to be dialed. Like it's not just something you can kind of go out and wing and rip. Whereas like a 50K, yeah, you probably could. 50 miler, yeah, maybe like some of the fast 100 milers you could too, but like if you want to like perform your very best, like those logistics are just the next level, which I kind of found very shocking because like I mean I was like knee deep in a spreadsheet for like a week, like documenting everything, and I was like, this is like prep it all in itself, which is kind of nuts. And I think like putting the sleep strategy in there is huge. So I think it's like, for a very detail oriented person, I think this is like the kind of distance that really, really benefits a lot of those kind of people.
Hmm. Yeah, no, you hit it spot on. I think like when I talk to people about like a really good crew experience, it's like you should walk away feeling like they took on both some of the cognitive and
Hmm.
logistical side of things. So like,
Yes.
yeah, so if like they're making the decisions for you to the degree where you just kind of come in and respond, or even just shortening the list so that you're not like sitting there and trying to kind of brainstorm and problem solve on your own, that makes a big difference. And with I guess the way to maybe kind of like touch on what you said with like the 50K, 50 mile, 100 mile, 200 miles, if you're off by a small margin for some of those shorter races, it may not catch up to you. But if you're
Right.
off by a small margin across the board at a race like Cocodona, it's probably going to eventually catch up to you and you're going to have to do something about it and then probably take a time hit. So, um, you kind of prefaced my the last topic I'm interested in with Cocodona, but we can keep talking about Cocodona if you've got other stuff too, is just like the relative predictability of finish times, which I think is just,
Mhm.
for one thing, it's tougher with ultra marathons in general. Like extrapolating out a well done 100-mile training plan to be able to predict a finishing time is difficult, especially if you haven't done the distance before or if you haven't done that course before. You don't have that kind of like pre-existing like amount of data to kind of pull from and build off of. But when you get into these 250s or 200s, it's just a whole nother level of that. And you said it perfectly. Like you have two people with the exact same moving pace, which means like from a fitness standpoint, they were basically like moving at the same pace. So their fitness couldn't have been their skills weren't that divergent. Their physical skills weren't that different from one another. But if one person can't sustain it for as long because they're spending more time in aid stations, maybe just a little less polished in how fast they transition or they're sleeping more, then yeah, that adds up to 10 hours at the end of a 250-mile race. And you could be 10 hours behind someone, even though you were technically moving the exact same pace as they were. So like my biggest like challenge as a coach, I think, even going into Cocodona this year, but I think if anything, it's probably in my mind a bigger challenge and something that if anything, I feel maybe less equipped at helping predict is how
Mhm.
do you set up like goal times
Mhm.
and splits and things like that when you have such a big range of what you could have for non-moving time. And because I think it's like you can look at the data and you can assume like based on like long run and race history, like if someone can like really comfortably move up an X% climb at a certain pace versus like, you have a range of it from different abilities. So you can start kind of like narrowing down like, well, if it takes you 12 minutes per mile to get up a 10% incline in training versus someone who takes 18 minutes per mile to get up that same climb, yeah, chances are you're not going to be running the same time as the
Mhm.
12-minute, that sort of stuff just makes sense. But like, yeah, but the non-moving time thing was something that's just like a really big kind of enigma essentially in terms of how much of that you want to account for and where too, because it might be something where like it's just one or two spots that were just drastically different than you expected, and then all of a sudden it throws off the entire pacing plan from there. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are that in terms of just is it something where you just have to kind of like be comfortable saying, hey, if you haven't done this before, we need to sort of just like we need to focus on moving at the paces that we assume you can when you are moving because We've seen that in the data, and then sort of problem solve with the non-moving time to some degree once we're out there. And then if you want to do this multiple times, then we can start building off of that data that we took in. Or is there a different strategy that you found that's helpful with that?
Yeah, it's such a good question because I had like, I had things pretty much planned. And like for the most part, like for me, the reason why I kind of planned a lot of this stuff was I wanted just more so like my crew to kind of just give them like general guide frames and timelines and stuff like that. But like also too, I wanted to compete. I mean, like A goal time, my A goal time was 70 hours, and like I even think like on my best potential I couldn't have been up there. Like I think just Harry and Jeff and Joe and Arlen just ran out of their minds out there and just had an incredible race. But like my A goal time was 70, and like I actually had like my paces calculated out like based on like my prior long runs. I did like a training camp weekend on the course, like an estimate, and I did have like estimated stoppage time per each aid station. And I think, yes, I had that mindset going in, like you kind of mentioned, like there's just so much that can go wrong in a 200-mile race. And like, you can't predict like when you maybe need to stop somewhere a little longer and stuff. So I kept like a very loose kind of range, and I kind of had like a different like A and kind of B goal scenario where I kind of had like ranges to say like, okay, if I get to this aid station around this time and this time, like I'm comfortably kind of in within the range that I want to. So it's like not being so like precise with the kind of stuff and just being a little bit more freeform. But the issue was that I kind of found, and this is I think also a little idiosyncratic for me, but I also think, and I'm sure you can experience it with the coach, like sometimes when people kind of put down stuff, and I know this is for me, like you can kind of let it get to your head a little bit if it kind of slips away, which in a 200-mile race, so you can guarantee at some point, like you're going to slip away from something just
Mhm.
from the thing of Murphy's Law. And so I remember I was pretty much like on my like goal pace and stuff like that. Like, and the way that I kind of like measured it out was like I knew that if I took a little bit more time at one section, maybe I could make up a little bit more time on the next section. But as long as I got to the time of where I needed to be, like I'm good. So it was more so like, okay, this section could take me X amount of hours, which would really equate to like a total average pace of this. And what I would do on my watch is like I would just have like average lap pace, and I would like lap each section. So like in my head, like I had like a little card with stuff that said, okay, this I want to kind of go for this, including moving time or including stoppage time as well. And if I can kind of hit within that range, it'd be great. And I was on track for that for like the first 120. Then like that section at Dead Horse, once I started getting 120, I started to get a little sleepy. I started to get kind of out. I also, and I kind of talked about this on my podcast, I kind of had a interesting experience with a pacer that just mentally just kind of made my mind go a little bit awry. But then I started to see the pace kind of dwindling, and then I got blisters, and I had to take a little bit more time at the aid stations. And I think like it's one of those things at that point where I said, okay, like let me just like stop the expectations and just kind of do the best that I very can, especially because like at that point it's the furthest I've ever ran. And so for me, kind of coming back to it, it's like I think it's good to maybe have some goal estimate times, but you got to be very flexible out there and not get so married to this stuff. And yes, that's the same advice you'd give for like 100-miler, 50-miler. But to your point, it's like for the most part, like you can course correct stuff, like you can get back to that space, like whereas like a 200-miler, like you can just be so far ahead of it. And I know the moment where I kind of dropped the expectations and did the best that I very could, it was amazing. And so I think it's like you gotta be careful, and I think you gotta know yourself and like what you get motivated by to see if that kind of stuff in a 200-miler like is not going to send you to a tailspin or not. Because like for me, I think just having that on there and like all the things that you kind of went wrong, like it did play out of my behavior because I was like getting in my head of like, oh man, I'm not getting the times as much like that. And once I kind of dropped that and I said, let me just do the best that I can, move efficiently as I can, hit at least try and hit the paces that I want to. And then at the aid stations, if I need to take more time, I'll take it. Because I think the other you also have to make like time investments, right? So like,
Mhm.
for example, for me, I was starting to get hot spots on my feet. Whereas like if I plan to take 20 minutes at this one aid station, or let's just say 10 minutes, 10 minutes at this aid station, but I needed 20 minutes to take 10 minutes to just take care of my feet, wash them off, cover the hot spot. I'll take that 10 minutes all day because if I know if I get blisters and I shred my feet, it might take me an hour, 2 hour longer on that section because I'll be moving slower.
Yeah.
So you kind of got to like on the fly, and like this at some point your crew makes these decisions for you. Like you said, it's like, what's the investment of time that I can take taking care of myself now that I know I'm going to get back an ROT, return on time, later in the sections. And so, but like if you kind of put the stuff on there, it gets, in terms of like your predicted times, it gets nuts. So it's like you got to be flexible. And like the last point I'll say on here too, I ran the first 37 with Mike McKnight, most of it. And I asked him a question. I said, like, hey, like, do you do like pace charts and stuff? And he was like, I used to, and now I don't. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And he said, like, I used to because it was a very similar thing, like what I was going through at Cocodona, where I was just kind of getting frustrated and everything like that. And he's like, I stopped doing pace charts and I just kind of went loosey goosey. And he's like, yeah, it was a little bit more pressure on the crew. But he told me a story at Bigfoot where he was running, and I think he wanted to go for like sub 70 or something like that, or sub 80, some time like that. I think it was like sub 70. And he doesn't, like, no planning, no nothing. He's just kind of running the best race he could. And he goes to Ben Light and he said, hey, like, is there a chance I can get sub 70? And Ben kind of looks at him and he goes, dude, like, you're on track for like sub 60. And he said at that point, like, Mike doesn't do pace charts anymore. And like, I mean, Mike's had amazing results after that. I think after that, that's when he got like the Triple Crown FKT. So I think it's like just knowing how you deal with the uncertainty, and like because structure in a 200-mile race is important, but like flexibility is like, I think the longer the distance you go, to kind of wrap this long point up, the longer the distance you go, the more emphasis you have to put on flexibility, right? So, and I think that's the biggest thing that I kind of learned along the way. I think for me, yeah, I'll have like estimated times, but I think I'm just going to try and run the best race I can. And I think it's like one of those scenarios where it's like, if the training's right, if I'm dialed in and I run the best race I can, the cards will kind of fall into place. So I don't know. Does that help to answer the question that you were? I know it was a long ramble, but
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think it's interesting. I feel like the way I kind of fall on this one now is like if someone wants to get very detailed, I would
yeah.
say what we probably want to do, assuming you have access to like this data, um, let's figure out like what is kind of bottom of the barrel level zero like scenario for a section of type of terrain. So like if you break Cocodona up into like however many sections you determine, figure out like from prior data, whether it be in training or races, like when things are just like when nothing is working and you're just at the pits, how slow is that actually? And
Mm-hmm.
then kind of like within reason, because obviously there's going to be like a speed limit that you should put on yourself for something of this duration where you're
Yeah.
like, I shouldn't tempt going faster in this because it's just going to pull from the future parts of the race, and kind of figure out like what is optimal in like kind of like that 200, if we're talking about Cocodona, 250-mile duration, and then you sort of have those charts for every section. So it's not trying to unpack the entire course, but it's like, okay, we finished this section, you fall somewhere in that range. Now we're on to the next section, and we have that new sheet where we have bottom of the barrel,
Mm-hmm.
we have absolute perfection, and everything in between. So that we're kind of like using that as kind of a general guide or a general target. And I think that maybe would just also feed into kind of helping chunk the race as well, which obviously with these long things like chunking it into manageable sections is going to be a big piece of the planning, because you can't really wrap your head around 250 miles and think about that the entire time. You have to be thinking about the next stage versus what's coming up in a lot of cases. So uh, that's the way I would maybe look at it. From like the most structured I'd probably get would be have like
Mm-hmm.
section ranges based on like on data that we can like hopefully assume is relatively accurate. And obviously that sort of a strategy is gonna, it's almost like an advanced strategy in that it's more difficult to put all that information together, collect all that information, but you have to have it too. So it's probably not going to be someone who's new to the sport or someone who's done their first, is doing their first,
Mm-hmm.
first one. It might be someone like Mike, where there's a ton of data out there, where if he just pulls data just from the number of 200 milers he's done, he can probably see like, oh, when I'm at my absolute pits, this is how fast I move on a section of like this type of terrain. And when I'm at my absolute best, this is where I move on a section of this type of terrain. So that's my range for that section. And then, do that spaced out. That would be the way I'd look at it if I wanted to get like really detailed. It's funny, I call my coaching clients that are like they crave that kind of like, I will say like kind of security from data, is like my spreadsheet
Mm-hmm.
guys, spreadsheet
Yeah.
guys and gals.
Yes.
They want that data. They want some structure there because they can rest at night thinking, okay, whether this
Yes.
plan is accurate or not, there's a plan there.
For sure. Yeah. And that's such a, I mean, it's like a good, like, little thing. And it like has you confidence that you can do it. And I think it's something that, obviously, like, even if you're trying to chase cutoffs or anything, like, it's just good to know you can make it. Right. And
Mhm.
I think it's like an important thing. But I think like you nailed it. I love that you like kind of separated into the mindset of like someone who's maybe doing this for the first time versus someone who has more data points. Cause like the way that I look at it is like, yes, my goal was 70 hours. I ended up running 86. So like, yeah, you look at that 16-hour gap and like, yeah, like if we were just measuring that as like the base of success, like it's like, okay, that's disappointing. But I remember, and like, by the way, anyone listening, Zach actually coached me through my first 200 milers too, by the way. So couldn't have gotten to Cocodona without your help, Zach. I will say that for sure. But when we were working together for Zion, like my time was like 24 hours, but that was my first 100 miler. And then the next time I ran Javelina, granted easier course, easier terrain, all that kind of stuff. I mean, 16:36, like even just with easier course, like I thought that was like a pretty cool jump. And like,
Yeah.
I think the only, like, yes, obviously, like, you put me on a great training plan. I think we did a lot more speed stuff that session, but I think like a lot of that value came from the data points, right? So like my point where I'm kind of circumnavigating for this, and for anyone listening, is like when you're doing like a first of the race, I think it's like good to know it's like, okay, this is the first time I'm experiencing this. And it's like, if you kind of try and plan it out, you don't really know, like to your point, like how you deal with like the low points. Cause like, I mean, there was a point from me from Schnebly Hill to Munns Park. And dude, I could not like control my emotions at all. And like, it was so weird for me because like in 100 miler, like I usually feel like I've been pretty good with like, kind of, ninjing the mind, right? Like, negative thought comes in. Okay, let me redirect it. And I try to do that so many times and it just like wouldn't be there. And like, but I'd never experienced that before and I was moving slow and stuff. Now that I know that it's kind of there, I know I can like deal with that. So like, yes, I finished 86 hours, 16 hours over my goal, but like I know I'm like, okay, now I know what I need to do within those like 16 hours to cut that off for the next time. But I wouldn't have known that unless I've kind of been in it, right? So it's like, I think to kind of like supplement your point on there, and for anyone listening, it's like structure is good, and if it gives you the security, go for it. But I think it's like one of those things. It's like it becomes much more effective when you have more data points. And like I think if you're going to a race first of the kind, there's a lot more margin of error in that data, just because like you just simply don't know past. I remember that moment I passed like 100 miles at Cocodona, and I was like, well, every step under here is the unknown, And I think I'm excited because like that data is going to help for like the future. So I think that's like anyone listening who's like maybe going first time 200 miler, like it's just like embracing the unknown and knowing that like you don't know what you don't know. And yes, we can make best guesses and stuff, but I think it's like have a little bit more grace for yourself during those moments, like because you're literally learning. And I think that's the exciting part of it all. It's just the learning. And then if you want to go another crack at it, whether it's that 200 or another, like that's like where you can like get that extra data point to give a good result.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off, and Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you. Links and details can be found in the show notes and the episode landing page. You can also check out a full description of how I use all of these products in my own training and racing at the end of this podcast episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's interesting stuff. I'll say like in the spirit of like kind of current events and kind of topics that are I don't know about time sensitive necessarily, but kind of new. Did you see today? Sorry, this is a little bit of a pivot, but it's along the lines of
No,
longer stuff. The women's 48-hour world record got broken.
I did not see that. Oh my gosh, no way.
Yeah, and it just came across my radar like a couple hours before we hopped on this call. So I don't think you probably had a chance to even look to see, but I think it was I'm trying to remember at what event it was, but they had actually this kind of actually goes with what we're talking about with the competitive pressure too. It was Stein Rex went only I think it was only like 200 and some 228 meters further than Camille's record that she broke last year in, believe, February, which was like a pretty big upgrade. I think it was like 20 miles onto the prior one.
Oh
Uh,
my god.
but there was two women there that were kind of like neck and neck throughout the majority of the 48 hours, where they were like 4 to 5 minutes apart, kind of chasing one another more or less. It was Stein Rex who ended up breaking it, and then Irina Masanova was just behind her. So it's just like one of those things where like you find yourself going 228 meters past the prior world record. How much of a value is it to have someone that's kind of keeping the heat on you, where like in a 48-hour race, someone's 5 minutes behind you? That's just like a very small blip before they're ahead of you. And how much of that is a value to keeping you on pace for that record versus letting that slip? It's just a different, it's interesting to see. Like, I would have never guessed that at this point in the growth of the sport, we would see competitive pressure in the 48 hour to the degree where you have people that close to one another. But again, another sign that we're seeing kind of more interest and more interest in general with the sport, of course. Um, but with these longer things that maybe historically would have been a little more obscure to a lot of people following the sport or participating in the sport, we're starting to see that stuff get pushed a little bit too.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, even just look at like some of like the, 100-mile golden ticket events, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
Javelina is a great example of that, right? So Javelina and like, your course record and Pat's course record kind of like, stood the test of time for a while. And then like now, then it became a golden ticket event. And
Yeah.
like, and granted, of course, right, the last 2 years have been very cooler temperatures. So obviously that plays a role. But I mean, the last 2 years, the course records was just obliterated. I mean, like
Uh-huh.
just like obliterated out of the field. And it's not just like the top guy doing. I mean, last year, the top three all got like below
Yep.
course record significantly. And it's like I think that it goes to show, and I think like one of the most interesting studies, like I'm blanking on who it actually was, like, but they did like a study on like performance in competition, and like if you're just performing solo, and like they took a group that was just performing solo versus a group that was performing against competitors, and like within that data, the group who was competing always outperformed the person just like going on to themselves and stuff. And I think like now when you're getting the sport to be just so much more competitive, and like I mean, you look at like the golden ticket, like once that gets that label on that race, like the times are just like not even just from like a people getting into, but like the difference in times are
Hmm.
just insane. And I think that just shows like the level of competition. And I mean, I think it's like customary now. Every golden ticket race, you can almost guess it's going to be like a course record. Like it's kind
Yeah.
of it's wild. But I think that just shows to like how competitive the sport's getting. And even to your point too, right? Like you're seeing a lot of these obscure kind of events and distances, which I would put the 200 miles, like that was an obscure distance. Now it's like kind of namesake 48 hours, right? That's an obscure kind of like event, but like now you see people going for these records. And I think, more people are kind of attempting these like fixed time kind of things. And, you
Hmm.
have events like Further that kind of like, I mean, a
Yeah.
mainstream brand like Lululemon bringing something like a 6-day event, which is like incredibly obscure. Now it's like this mainstream thing. And like you have like a lot of people look into that and be like, oh, maybe I could do that. Maybe I could go for that. And I think that's where you're kind of seeing this sport. It's just like, there's a degree of just not even just like how popular it gets, but I think like how popular it gets, how competitive it gets, and like how much mainstream access ultra running gets, like all I feel like are just such a positive correlation, but they all kind of build off of each other, which is just like such a cool thing to see. And I think it just is a testament to honestly, like I really think it comes down to like the media and the showcasing and like just how these things have been put on the map. And I think that is such a cool sign for ultra trail running, is that like, and just ultra running in general, not just trail, which is how accessible it's getting. Like, and not even
Hmm.
just for people who just want to get in the sport, but just people competing, right? Because like you have people again, like to bring back in the conversation, not to keep dragging it out, but like guys like Arlen Glick who are like 100-mile specialties. They see Cocodona through the live stream and things like that, and they're like, I could do it, and then they go out and go for a you know uh, third place finish at Cocodona. And then, you have something like Further where you have like athletes like Leah Yingling, who's again like 100 miles and she crosses 300-mile mark, at a 6-day event, which is like so kind of out of the wheelhouse and stuff. So I think like over the years, we might see more, and I'm curious of your thoughts on this, but I think we'll see like more people who are competitive in maybe one area of the sport kind of try and dive into other areas of the sport, or just competition kind of raises across like maybe these events and distances or even races that just maybe generally haven't gotten love, that just start to kind of bolster up. I don't know, what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I got a few thoughts. I would say one specifically to Leah, I think because you had mentioned, I didn't know this until you said it, but she signed up for Cocodona next year.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder like how much the Lululemon 6-day event
Yeah.
further project just kind of gave her a perspective that put her in a position where she was open to signing up to Cocodona. Maybe she was going to do that anyway, but I would be curious to hear what she'd say. Like maybe it was something where it's like, hey, I was thinking about doing 100 miles for a while, and that was kind of where I like to be. And then, you know, the Lululemon Further project was a big production, so I'm sure she had some motivation to do it at least. And then by doing it, determined, hey, this is actually something I maybe enjoy more than I thought. It's clearly a new experience for her, and then that opened up like an opportunity in her mind to say, okay, well, if I could do that, why not Cocodona? Whereas otherwise, maybe
Mm,
she's not even thinking about Cocodona. I think that's a really interesting, assuming I'm accurate by that thought process, or even if I'm not, there are people who will have that sort of a scenario
mhm,
where they do something because they're exposed to it from maybe a non-traditional way, and then because of that, they open up their framework of what is in their wheelhouse or what they're actually interested in doing, getting interested in. Because I know people who would have sworn off doing an ultra marathon, and then all
yeah.
of a sudden they do one for one reason or the other, and now they're hooked on them. So it's like there's this kind of weird little like unless you've experienced it, you don't really know whether you're motivated to do it or not. And then you get like an experience that I assume the further project presented to someone like Leah. And now all of a sudden maybe like there's just a lot more exciting, motivating options available to her in her mind than were before. So I think that's really interesting. I think to kind of bring that more general is I just think like when you talk about like accessibility, it's like I see the sport kind of having this interesting kind of spot right now. I mean, when we have all like the UTMB stuff, which is kind of like,
Mm,
been a bit of a controversy over the years, and especially last year in terms of just like what we want from like kind of an ultra marathon community, and where an organization like Ironman that owns UTMB now fits within that, when they're going to have much more of a corporate model of kind
mm,
of, I would say the glass half full thought process with them acquiring UTMB was that we have this scenario where we put a huge spotlight on the sport because they're going to do that. More
mm,
people will know about ultra running because of Ironman owning UTMB than would have before. So, what happens next? Does that put us in a position where we're looking at it as, oh, wow, there's this sport that has all these options, from 48-hour track events to mom and pop 50Ks to the Western States 100 to UTMB certified races? Or does it kind of pigeonhole the mindset into, oh, if you want to be an ultra marathon runner, you have to do a UTMB certified course. If you don't
mm,
do a UTMB certified course, what are you even doing? You're not a real ultra marathon runner. So you kind of have like these like different kind of potential scenarios at play here. And I think the hope is that with the amount of kind of just like access to information, organizations like Aravaipa's like
mm,
live stream stuff that are going to be able to put spotlights on smaller event, well, what otherwise would have been smaller events. Now all of a sudden
yeah.
you can live stream and get access to them. And I think one of the big reasons Cocodona has grown as fast as because of that live stream and their ability to
Mhm,
kind of produce content out of it, and everything that kind of goes with that. So it's like you kind of have this scenario of like, what I hope to happen is someone decides, someone's exposed to ultra running for one reason or the other. Maybe a friend told them about, maybe they came across a live stream, maybe they came off of just an article or something like that. And rather than thinking like, oh, I have to do this specific thing in order to like try an ultra marathon, they're able to easily figure out, oh, you know what? There's a 50-mile that's
mm,
only 45 minutes from my house. I would have never known. And then they can engage with it there because, there is also like the accessibility side of things where like it ain't cheap to do Cocodona. It's not cheap
yeah.
to do any of the 200 miles.
Yes.
Although there is this one in Nebraska. It's like a Rails to Trails 200 miler where I don't
Oh, is
know
that
if
the
is it still the,
cowboy?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't
I've
know.
heard about this. That is like I don't know. Like that
Did
is
you see how much it cost to do that one?
no, how what's the entry fee?
Last I saw, it may have changed, but last I saw it was $150. So
For a 200
yeah, that's like like a that's like 5 to 10% of what you pay for one of the major 200 miles these days.
or even
That's just
even
the
some of the
entry.
hundreds.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like the entry fee for that one. But yeah, there's that obstacle to get over, obviously. And then, the entry fee is expensive in and of itself, but it's an expensive event to do just
Oh
if
yeah.
you're gonna have a crew. I mean, we talked about like the benefits of having a crew. Well, you have to, if you're doing a 250-mile race, and let's say it's to take you 4 days to finish, you have to have a crew that can take that time away from whatever they would be doing otherwise, likely on your dime, coming out there to help
Hmm.
to some degree. And, you have to either like find a way to bootstrap that crew or just spend a bunch of money, and you can easily rack up a pretty big bill with that. So it's like from an accessibility standpoint, just like a general like theme of like as this sport grows, I want to I like to think about just what are the likelihood of someone hearing about it, feeling like they can actually get into it in a way that they can approach. Um, my hope is that like we keep some spotlight on some of these events that are a little easier. Because like I can drive less than an hour and find an ultra
Mm.
marathon from Austin, Texas, and you know, at worst spend a couple $100. So
Yeah.
it's like, that's way more accessible, obviously. Not entirely accessible, although there are, I think, opportunities to do ultra marathon stuff even cheaper than that if you're willing to go that way. But to some degree, I think it's like, yeah, as a sport as a whole, having kind of these different options highlighted often enough so people are just aware that it isn't always just the biggest, brightest, most expensive one that is their option in, that there is also a bunch of other things they can do to kind of engage with the sport, and that the community as a whole is still going to like recognize that as an achievement for what it is.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you said it best is like the highlighting, right? Because like if you think about a race like Western States, like I think, I mean, obviously it is like the North American, like, 100 miler championship, like it has been for years and years. But I think what speaks to a lot of the people putting into the lottery for that race is like you had books like Ultra Marathon Man
Yeah.
and a lot of these like earlier, like the Unbreakable, like there was a
Yeah.
lot of media and coverage and things that kind of went around it that again like took a race like that and brought it to the masses in some shape, right? And I do think Dean had like a big role in that with that book. And then Goggins still with like Moab 240. Like I mean
Mhm.
I think Moab 240 got really popular after Goggins's book because like I mean people knew who Courtney was, and then Courtney went on Joe Rogan and talked about it, and
Mhm.
it's like I think it's like once you have like these like mass accessibility distributions, like usually people get focused like on the event because like they hear someone talk about it and they're like, oh, I want to experience that thing, right? And
Mhm.
so when you have like all these like big events, like if you look at the correlation, it's like how much they have been kind of distributed to the mass public right now. That, like, to your point, it's like how do we highlight those like races that are smaller? And I think it's like organizations like Aravaipa, Tejas Trails, I know in Texas too, they have like these big, very like well-known events, right? I mean, like that Tejas were they Bandera, or is that a different organization? Yeah,
Mhm.
okay, so like Bandera was a golden ticket event, that was a big thing, but like now I know about Tejas, and if I'm ever in Texas, like I know that they have all these other smaller events that like maybe I haven't heard of, but like I know that is there too. Aravaipa, everybody knows Cocodona, Javelina, Black Canyon, but like what people don't know, and I mean because you used to live here, like they have
50
in the
more.
winter, yeah, they have like all these like little smaller races, but it's like I know that because I had the big ones and kind of like go into the small ones, and so it's like how do these like organizations who like put on these like lower things, like you can still celebrate the big race, but it's like how do you distribute your content in a way that's going to like show all these other smaller ones? And I think that's like a cool thing for a lot of people because I get it, like I mean, and I'm not saying this is foreshadowing for the future, but even with Ironman, right, in the triathlon world, like to do an Ironman, it's like $1,000 just entry fee. Like that's
Yeah.
pretty nuts. But like that's what you think about when you think about triathlon. But there's so many other smaller triathlons that you can kind of get into too. And so like UTMB, it's like everyone sees that and like getting to Mont Blanc and like doing all that stuff, and like they
Yeah.
think that might be the only thing. But I mean, to your point, I think the number I read this in a book and I don't know the stats, like, but it's like the number of 100 milers like 5 years ago versus today is absurd, and it's
Mhm.
like a lot of those 100 milers like aren't big. They might have like 20 people on the start line. And so like, but in the end of the day, it's like you don't always have to do the big thing. Sure, like you can put it on your list, but like, I think it's so interesting to see like how many smaller grassroots events are in those areas. And, I'd love to see like more of those kind of smaller, more connected to the community organizations. I think highlighting the big races are great, but it's like in doing so, like how can they also promote their other stuff? Like I love about Aravaipa. I mean, like they're really promoting a lot of their new East Coast races that they just got through that new
Mhm.
acquisition that like I hadn't heard of anything. Like, this Jigger Johnson 100 miler.
Dude, I was gonna ask you about
Yeah,
that.
I'd never heard of that, but like I look at like the video and the content and I'm like, this is awesome. But I wouldn't have known if Aravaipa didn't talk about it. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah. 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 And for listeners, Jigger Johnson has a section in the course where I've got a coaching client who's doing it, and he did it last year and got tapped out, I think at, if I remember correctly, it was like right before 80 miles,
Mm,
and which is like pretty common. It's got like a really low, like a 10% finisher rate or something like that. In
crazy.
fact, I think the women's course record is actually after the cutoff time.
That
So
is
like that
wild.
will change, by the way, now that it's getting some more spotlight on it. There'll be some women who go there and crush that. But it's just a really, like, if you want just a knock your socks off challenging course, like that's it. It had a 53% incline on one part of the course when I
Oh
was going
my
through the
gosh.
GPX file. Like I was plugging it into there's this website called Ultra Pacer. If you're not
I've
familiar
heard
with
of
it, you should check.
this.
Yeah, check
Yeah.
it out. You could plug in like, and actually they have a ton of data on there already. So if it's a well recognized enough course, it's already probably on there. But you can kind of plug in your goal finishing time, and you can plug in like how much like non-movement you want in like certain aid stations, and it will spit out like a pace chart for you, and it will also, you can have it calibrate moving pace from like certain like pitches. So like if it's like a
Hmm.
20% incline versus a 8% downhill, it'll adjust that, so then you could sort of like at least get like a ballpark figure of what you can expect. And what I like that from, and I'm pivoting a little bit here, but like what I like with that is like we can start to kind of wrap our head around whether a goal is reasonable or not. Because if I put
Hmm.
it in there and we kind of get those ballpark figures, and it turns out that like the pace it suggests you'd have to do to hit your goal time on this one climb is noticeably faster than what we can expect you to do in a long run, chances are we're getting a little too aggressive on that finishing goal
Hmm.
versus like, oh, it's 4 minutes per mile slower than what you could just do in a pretty easy, leisurely long run. Well, yeah, you're going to have some slowing with the duration of say 100 miles versus what you do in a long run. But if you have that big of a gap, we're getting somewhere with that. We're not getting too aggressive in most cases. We can start kind of like strategizing around what it'll take to actually hit that goal and everything that goes in it. So anyway, I was on that website just doing that. I found like this 53% incline spot on it. It's just like, yeah. So like you said, like I before that coaching client, I was not aware of that event. So um Aravaipa, and if I hadn't had that coaching client, Aravaipa would have been the organization because they just bought it. So it
Hmm.
was they're doing a lot with that. But kind of to sum up the topic in general, I think we kind of have two interesting examples. There's like the UTMB model where
Hmm.
they're sort of trying to keep things in-house as much as they can by buying or creating events and making you do those to get in. So if we remove ourselves from the top end of the sport and just look at the average person trying to get into the UTMB, they're going to have to do UTMB events to do
Hmm.
that. Whereas you have something like Western States, which is kind of like you kind of have UTMB and Western States as the 1A, 1B, or 1 and 2 as the
Yeah.
most competitive, like visibly noticed 100 milers in the world. And Western States has a totally different model. They make you qualify with a race, but they will let you use races outside of their affiliation
Hmm.
as long as it meets certain criteria. And what that does is it bolsters those events, because now if I'm somebody who says I want to do
Hmm.
Western States one day, I'm looking at maybe an 8-year timeline before I get in. So I need to do qualifiers every year. Well, any race organization that isn't part of Western States is got a growth potential by setting up their course in a way that Western State certifies it as a qualifier
Hmm.
race. So now you're kind of raising the tide for every one of these ultra races around the country, to kind of have some opportunity where when people are sitting to plan out their race schedule, if they want to stay in that Western lottery, one of those is going to be a qualifier race. And if you have a qualifier race, you're going to have increased numbers just based on that alone. So that's kind of, I think, like the model that I like to see in terms
Yeah.
of like growing yourself, but also kind of growing the rest of the sport with it in a way that's not necessarily like too too profit motivated, perhaps is a way to look at it, or too like one dimensional in kind of crowding out other people and creating just space for yourself.
Yeah, and people like choices, right? Like
Mhm.
UTMB, I think, I don't know the exact number, but if I'm just guesstimating, it's like maybe they have, I think, 5 or 6 races in the US, like Canyons, Desert Rats, like Kodiak, like just to name a few, right? And it's like, are you pigeonholed to just those 5 races every year? And they'll probably add more, but it's like, are you
Mhm.
pigeonholed to only those races? When you look at something like Western States, there's tons and tons of different
Tons of them.
qualifiers you can do. Like it's so it's just I think people like choices and variety, and like they don't want to feel like they're kind of like forced to do something. And I think that was kind of the big pushback with UTMB, is like people just felt like they're kind of forced the hands to like, do these events to get stones and stuff. And like people don't like that. Like people want choices, like they want to be able to do it. And even think I know this is like out of like the running scope, but like if you look at the triathlon space, like in then but Ironman was kind of like the king for years. Now they have this new organization called like PTO that's like basically like putting on these like all these different events competing on Ironman, and like the whole kind of triathlon space is like celebrating because like there's like choices now. Like there's just like like there's like more choices. And so I think it's like people don't want to be like pigeonholed into just like not being able to be flexible, because then yeah, because like over time, yes, like the perception is like, well, if these are the only races I can do to this, then it's like you have the power to keep charging these exorbitant prices. And I think like obviously some people maybe make pretty like extended kind of predictions on that, but I think like people just want choices to get to that bigger goal. And that's why I like that Western States model. And I think it's going to get better because, hopefully a lot of these like small, I think there's a lot more smaller races. And then you have like a lot of like different influencers in the space, like also like putting on their own events and stuff. And
Mhm.
I think that's going to like, I mean, BPN, right? They did that like exclusive 50-mile event that like got, the lottery got like maxed out like crazy. Like, and so I would love to see a lot more of that. And I think you will like over this just because I think, there's just such a big community vibe to trail running. And I think that's why UTMB hasn't been as, when I say successful, meaning like the aura of like the OG kind of running communities, because like it lost touch of the community. And I think the community will come back. I'm not saying UTMB is a bad thing or anything. Like I do think there's, yes, I mean, yes, they made mistakes, but I also think there's some good that's going to come with it for sure. But I think that's what's kind of like people just feel very limited and also a little slighted because it's just, that kind of perception.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Um, One other topic that I want to touch on. Have you been following the Spring Energy
Oh
situation?
God, yeah. Oh yeah. That is wild. Like, yeah. It's just like it makes me very, and I'm not saying like every other brand's doing that, but it just makes me skeptical in general about like nutrition and just like running nutrition in general. Like, I mean, even yeah, Spring. I mean, like I've used the product a few times before, and like I've even had athletes personally who have used the product and like they've bonked in races. And we try and figure out like troubleshoot like what happened. Like hydration was on there, pacing was good, like everything was good. And I mean, I don't know. Like at the time it was a mystery. Now you kind of look back on it, but it's a tough situation because I don't, and again there's nothing, no way of me to tell. I don't think it was malicious, but I think there's just got to be more control in that kind of area, like and that raises a bigger question because like how do we know what any of these other brands are doing? And I'm not trying to like unravel like a huge conspiracy on like nutrition in general,
Yeah.
but I think it's one of those things that has us when we be so reliant on something. I think it just kind of opens the eyes a little bit in terms of just like what works for you. And, if it feels like it doesn't work, like maybe you just gotta, maybe not lean on, what you're kind of being told as much and pivot to, I don't know. It's just, it's a very, it has me just not even just lose trust in just one company, but maybe in general. I don't know. It's a little like raises
Raises skepticism
skepticism.
at least.
Yeah. How
Yeah.
do you
And
feel
for
about it?
Yeah, I mean, for the listeners who are unaware or just kind of passively heard some stuff, it was like, so Spring Energy, they make like a gel essentially that you're going to use during a race to fuel. And they had marketed a few of their products. Like most of these gels, they'll market it like any food where it's like number of calories, number of carbs, all that kind of the nutrition breakdown of it. So they had an option that was supposed to be, I believe it was 180 calories that actually only contained like 80. So it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
like a small divergence from the advertisement. Because one thing I think that I found really interesting about this topic as a whole was people were really surprised on average, from my experience, at what the legal range is. So like if you're
Mm-hmm.
making a gel, like if Joe and I decide to get together and make a gel and like we're putting on our label and stuff like that, we have a 20% buffer in terms of its accuracy. So like you could have a gel that says 100 calories on it, as long as it's actually got like 81, you're not
Mm-hmm.
in any sort of trouble with that. Although, like, if your customer base finds out about that, they're probably not going to be happy because I think 20% is probably unacceptable to the average customer, although it's not
Mm-hmm.
technically illegal. So, I mean, but with the Spring Energy one, it turned out it was like, greater than 50% less than what they were advertising it. And I mean, there was all sorts of like, kind of like, this had been like something that was sort of boiling over the course of a few weeks where there was some suspicion. Some people got about doing some kind of research on their own, I guess you'll say, and starting to raise some legitimate questions. And, you know, he had all the things like, oh, it was one batch. It's just this one product in question, which was called Awesome Sauce. Turns out, like, I think there was two different places that actually sent these in to third party
Mhm.
labs that got them tested. It wasn't just that one. It was like they had three different ones of theirs all coming in at least 50% lower than advertised. So big problem for them. Yeah, like you said, I don't know like what level of like ignorance versus kind of like, oh, we made a mistake, let's sweep it under the rug versus we made a mistake or we're doing this intentionally. Like, who knows? It seems odd that they would do that intentionally because
Mhm.
it's such a big enough problem when you're that far off that you have to think if you're doing that intentionally that it's just a timeline between
Mhm.
like before people just either start losing trust in your product to the degree where they try something different and get such a better experience and then say, well, I'm not going to use that one anymore. I'm going to use this one instead. So it's just like you'd think that like the marketplace would clear up a lot of that over time if that's your goal is to try to deceive people. But in this case, it seemed to eventually catch up to them, but maybe not soon enough to save everybody's race. Like you mentioned, you had some coaching clients. I know I had some coaching clients that have been using Spring to at least some degree, uh, that weren't all that happy about it. But um, yeah, I mean, it's a mess. I think the interesting thing was one of Goo's products got tested alongside the Springs Mason, and that one actually
Yeah.
came in above. So theirs were
Yes.
marketed at like 21 grams, and it came back at 24. So
Yes.
depending on how you look at that, you know, like more is I'm most customers are going to be more happy with more versus less. But to the precision side of things, it's like if there's a doubt, it's like how precise can we trust any of this stuff in terms of how well we structure our intra-race kind of fueling needs, and and to what degree do we need to be that precise? I guess I think obviously 50% is unacceptable, but 3 grams here, 2 grams there, probably something you can more or less get away with.
Yeah, 100%. And it's like, I I 100% can like understand like, I mean, yes, like, and I think the thing that made Spring worse was it was just so expensive. I mean, like you were paying like
Yeah.
$4.50 for one gel. And like if you're getting 70 calories out of that, you can get like an applesauce packet that is literally like at Costco. If you get like those go-go squeeze packets, it's like 72 cents a packet with the same exact nutritional value of what Spring is. I get that. Like I'm even pissed about that. Like that's just crazy. But I do think like, like is that something, and this is the kind of way that I like to look about it. Like I think the wrong way to look about it personally, and I might get a lot of crap for this. So, but I think the wrong way to look at it is like my race was ruined because Spring had lower nutritional value. I'm seeing a lot of that. And I personally just don't think that's a great way to look at things because like, listen, like you can have a race and like gear could crap out and anything like that. Like, but it's like you want to have this locus of control. Like, and so like, sure, like, I don't know. I really think I think it's good that we're bringing this to light for sure, 100%. But I think it just also like raises a kind of importance on like ultra running. It's like, yeah, like you got to have a locus of control. Like, hey, maybe the stuff you're taking isn't there. Like you got to like assess by feel. Like you have a bad race, like with some nutritional stuff. Like maybe you just need to just switch up the nutrition, right? Like
Mhm.
maybe you just need to like have some things around or just figure some stuff out. But like, in the end of the day, like, yes, I know it raised like some skepticism around like nutrition in general and stuff. But the one thing I really hope is like people, take a little bit more of a locus of control because it's like that's how like ultra running is done. Like if you start blaming like other stuff and everything, it's hard to ever really put together a great race. And and I'm not saying like what Spring did is excusable because it's definitely not for sure. But I would just hope that like what kind of comes from this is like people. It's like if I don't feel good using this certain nutritional
Mhm.
product out there, then even if I'm hitting like the calorie goals and stuff, like maybe I need to switch. And it's like great, like I'm gonna go through and switch. And I know people have, claimed to have some like really drastic injuries and stuff like that, maybe fueling on Spring, which again, I'm not trying to minimize or anything, but I think there's a lot of like finger pointing, and I think that rightly should be so. But I'm hoping that it's like, it's one of those things that we have to like, come back in the end of the day. If something's not working for us, we might need to just figure that out. And like that's I think is a very empowering kind of point for just
Yeah.
kind of taking away from this.
You know, it's a good point. I think like you're right. You get all the different kind of takes and perspectives on it because you go to the the most angry person in the situation is probably the person who's like, I use spring pretty heavily in training and racing. And since it was like a fraction of what I expect I was getting, I was underfueled during training. I was underfueled during my race. Therefore, I got subpar results.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's like if you take that out long enough, it gets to a point where you can ask the question, rightfully so, in my opinion.
Hmm.
Well, if you thought you were taking in X amount of nutrition in your training and noticed you were losing weight, I would imagine in that scenario, unless you're just really intuitive about what you're eating and you're just kind of like not tracking any of that other than your intra workout stuff. It's like I think it's like you said, you're going to eventually probably notice something. And there's a lot of variables, so I don't want to say like for sure you're going to notice something. But my experience with a lot of stuff is like you can kind of tell to some degree, like if you're trying enough products, and this is maybe a case for adding some variety to both your planning when you're doing long runs and stuff like that, to kind of come up with what's going to work best for you, is just try some different stuff and just see how your body responds to it to some degree too. Because if
Yes.
you have long runs that are consistently better on X product versus Y product, well, chances are on race day, X product is going to be better for you than Y product.
Hmm.
So like, yeah, so if someone who's trying to like blame everything on the fact that the mislabeling was there and take no accountability, that's probably a stretch because then you can just say, well, how could you possibly have been not trying anything else,
Yeah.
like to kind of like because I would assume like if there's two things here. There would be let's say I determined I need to get in 60 grams per hour in order to have a high quality training run. Well, if I'm routinely thinking I'm getting 60 grams per hour and actually getting 25,
Hmm.
I'm eventually going to be like, something's not working here. Let's try something different and see if I get a better outcome. And then I'm going to do that. I'm going to probably get a better outcome and then uh, decide to make a change. Or the 60 gram per hour target that you were going for was an artificially high number and
Hmm.
you were actually only getting 25 grams, but 25 grams was enough to actually get what you were looking for.
Yes.
And it's just a false assumption in your mind that you actually needed 60. And, like there's that potential scenario too, where like, I think especially what makes it maybe overcomplicates it is we sort of have this like, I mean, we have all sorts of different worlds and theories and approaches when it comes to nutrition in ultra running. But one that's more recent in the last few years is this like hyperfueling strategy. I mean, I had Hayden
Hmm.
Hawks on the podcast a while back after he won Black Canyon. He hit 109 grams per hour. So, like,
That's insane.
yeah, and I mean, you can make an argument that based on Hayden's diet, his approach, and everything, the pace he was running, the workload he was producing on an hourly basis on a course like Black Canyon, he maybe needs higher than even what would, or at least the top end of what the recommendations would suggest. And that by going beyond that is, as long as he doesn't get a digestive issue, a fair bet to make. But like the average person who's maybe got like two-thirds or half the workload that Hayden does on a similar course. They might take in as much fuel over the course of the event, but their event is 15 hours versus seven and a
Hmm.
half.
Hmm.
So for them to be targeting 100 plus grams per hour isn't the move in most cases in
Hmm.
order to get what they need from like a workload and then a distribution between fat and carb metabolism. So for that person, if they go in thinking, oh, well, Hayden's doing 109 grams per hour,
Right.
I'm going to try to do 100 grams per hour, and then they use spring energy, they're probably getting what they need.
That's a
So
good point.
there's,
And they're like, this
yeah,
is great, but it's really
yeah.
like 60 carbs. Yeah.
Yeah, so I haven't heard about the person who's like, oh, turns out I'm just better equipped to metabolize fat and not as reliant on carbohydrate. And
Mm.
I would have never known that if it weren't for being deceived by spring energy.
Well, I loved your post. Like you put the story thing. You're like, hey, it turns out that a lot of people are more fat adapted. And I'm like, that's a good thing. Like, hey, there are some good things coming out of this, people, for some. Yeah. So it's
And there's
so
always
true.
another side.
There's always another side, but you made a great point. I think it's just testing, seeing what works for you. Cause like, I mean, if an athlete comes to me and like I say, hey, like I want you to target 300 calories an hour, and they're on their long runs and they're feeling like kind of bonky. It's like, okay, well, maybe we need to try 350. Maybe we need to try,
Mhm.
400 if they're really like out there and it's super hot and they're kind of pushing the pace a bit, right? It's like, it's just like knowing your body, and like even if like the numbers, because like I mean especially nutrition, hydration, it's so specific to the person, like just like being mindful of those things and kind of putting it out. And I think yeah, I think that's like the biggest thing from that too. But yeah, I mean, they're I mean, even so, like if you have raced on spring before and not had issues, which I know there's some people who have, like for sure, like a lot of like my close friends, it's like, okay, like maybe, yeah, maybe your nutritional needs are a little less. Like, and that's like not a bad thing, but it's like good information to use. And so, yeah, I think we're, it's one of those things where right now I think we can really like use this more from like an internal perspective. But I think all the time in training, because listen, this won't be the first time. There'll be some other company doing some weird stuff that like affects like a way a certain product is, or like maybe studies come out and say like this certain thing is not good for us or like whatever, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, like, but I think in the end of the day, if you're mindful of how you're performing and like what your results are and how you react to a certain thing, that's like will help the course correct some things. Maybe not like 50% calories in spring, but my whole point is like let's continue to just be mindful of like how we're responding to things like
Hmm.
in training and what we're using out there.
Yeah. Yeah, and some skepticism's probably good because it keeps
For
you
sure.
like open to trying different things in the presence of what you maybe thought were was concrete in the past. But um Joe, I don't want to take up too much time. You might actually have a hard out coming up here pretty
Yeah,
soon.
I got in like 4 minutes, but
Oh,
yeah,
okay. So yeah,
I would, dude, I wish I could keep talking
yeah.
for like, God,
Well,
this
we'll
was
do
so
more of
fun.
these. We'll do more
This
of
is
these. I
so
think this will be
fun.
great to check in every month or so and kind of just top or check in on some of the happenings in the world of ultra. But before I let you go, where can people find you? I know you got Everyday Ultra podcast, you coach, you race, you're on social media. What's the spots to find you?
Absolutely. And by the way, yes, Zach said that I do coach, but I credit probably like a majority of the progress that I've made and just as a coach, as an athlete, as just my knowledge in the sport to Zach. Zach was my very first coach, like helped me to hit PR at Javelina and just like I want to say, man, like you've been probably the most monumental figure in my ultra running career. So I just want to say like thank you for that. So yes, I
I
do coach
appreciate it.
athletes, but I learned a lot from the guy on the other side of the mic here. So yes, but I do coach Everyday Ultra. We do Everyday Ultra coaching. I have two other assistant coaches as well, and we help you hit your ultra goals, whether that's your first 50K or you want to PR your 250 miler. And so yeah, we do that, and then we have the Everyday Ultra podcast, which is we release episodes every week on helping you be a better endurance athlete every day. And so yeah, you can listen wherever podcasts are at, and yeah, that's kind of where we're at on here too. But again, like everyone sees Everyday Ultra, but Zach Bitter, HPO, all of his coaching has had a lot to do to help to build this up. So I cannot say any of that stuff without crediting you for sure.
Well, appreciate it. And like I'll add all that stuff to the show notes so listeners can come and find it. And on a future episode, maybe we'll touch on kind of your entrance into ultra running and stuff like this. I know you have a great background story of kind of where you've come from and gotten to where you are today. So stay tuned for that, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'll have to get you back on the pod too, man. It's funny enough, like this is a good insight. My number one most downloaded episode of all time was our first podcast interview.
Oh, right on.
Like more than like Sally McRae, Candid, like more than like yeah, like it continues to get like listens every week. So yeah, so that's a little fun insight for you.
Good to hear. No, I love to hear it. Awesome, Joe. Well, I'll let you get to what's next for you today, but thanks again for coming on and chatting about some ultra content.
Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure, and excited to stay in touch, man. And keep crushing it, man. Your training's looking amazing. So keep up the amazing work. Three sub 3 marathons. Me and Kyle Curtin were talking about the other day. We're like, dude, Zach is on another level. So keep crushing it, man.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Awesome, man. We'll talk soon. Take care.
Bye bye.
Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around to hear more about how I use the products that sponsor the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I have updated a few things, so if you follow closely, you may notice some new details here. I have taken a lot of time identifying these brands, and I'm incredibly grateful that they have provided a product that I use routinely and are also interested in supporting my work here at the Human Performance Outliers podcast. So here is how I use them. S Fuels is a product that follows a principle of right fuel at the right time. For me, this means I can anchor my nutrition in a fat dominant way, but not neglect the powerful application of carbohydrates when they are needed. Their product lineup maps the low carbohydrate dietary protocol that I have used for endurance since 2011. Here's how I use some of their product lineup and some of their second generation products that they've just recently brought to market. First is their Zone 4 and Zone 5 product. I use these for intra-workout and race carbohydrate targets. I will use the Zone 4 in less glycolytic settings that still benefit from some carbohydrate, and Zone 5 for workouts that I prefer, workouts and races where I want to maximize my carb to other fuel source exogenous inputs. In short, I prefer Zone 5 when my carb inputs are at their highest and I want to kind of go straight to that source. Zone 2 is a fat-based powder that uses C8 and C10 MCTs that are combined with L-glutamine. I use this for lower intensity workouts to help promote higher fat oxidation rates without neglecting energy deficits. So in short, if I'm doing something longer and I want to keep carbs out, but I don't want to have a huge calorie deficit, Zone 2 plays a great role there. Revival is a post-workout race protein powder that I can easily add to some yogurt or a low-carb smoothie to quickly jumpstart the recovery process. I will use a product like this most often when I'm completing training sessions and have a lower appetite or desire to eat solid foods right after, but want to get a jumpstart on replacing some of the stuff that I left out there. Primed is my go-to caffeine source for training and racing. It combines green tea extract, L-carnitine, taurine, and B vitamins, which all combine to help support energy production, fat metabolism, and reduce perceived effort. Life Bars are a product that have been one of my favorites on the S Fuels lineup for some time now, and they are a great combo of healthy fats and protein that I can have prior to a big training session, race, or simply as a snack on heavier training days. Grain-free breakfast cereal is something that I can sub in for just about any time I would have put granola on something when I was a more moderate high-carb person. So this is a good substitute for that. Oftentimes I will put it on top of things like yogurt as a topper or something like that. If you're interested in more details about their product lineup, the science behind it, and everything else, head over to sfuelsgolonger.com for up to 15% off your next order. And stay tuned for some product giveaways and promos over the course of the year. I got introduced to Janji last year and have really enjoyed having some of their products in my running and gym rotation. Janji makes pants, shorts, outerwear, tops, and accessories. Janji apparel is made with durability in mind and is backed by a 5-year run everywhere guarantee. Each design is informed by a different part of the world through collaboration with local artists and in partnership with clean water nonprofits with whom they have contributed over $1 million donated to clean water solutions. Some key features that Janji really focuses on is lightweight, breathable, moisture wicking, odor resistant, thermal regulation, and a super soft and flexible material. Here are the products that I've been using a lot so far this summer. I'm still going with the AFO middle short for very light, breathable training sessions where minimal pockets and extras are not desired. So think a very humid summer training run where I want as little on as I can get away with and feel like it's not getting bogged down with a bunch of sweat. The 5-inch multi-short. So I'll sub this one in for sessions where I do want a bit more storage capacity that is placed in the right areas or the right spots. So think things like where I put my phone, does it sit nicely? Or is there a spot to put my key where it's not flopping around or poking me in an awkward place or things like that? So I really like the 5-inch multi-short for that sort of a training session. A product I'm really excited about, which isn't necessarily a training gear per se, is the Multipass Mini and Sling Bags. These are the newest items I have started using from Janji. The only question for me is how much stuff do I need, which will determine which one of these I will bring with me. The Multipass is a great for just stashing things like your keys, wallets, phones, headphones, or any item you want to have with you, all while keeping your pockets free from clutter. It's got a nice clippable strap that you can put around your waist or over your shoulder. I'll upgrade to the sling bag if I'm bringing a little more stuff and it's just not enough room inside that Multipass Mini. So think things like the size of a water bottle, or if I'm just going to be on a little longer session or heading to the airport or something like that, and I just need more storage, but with that same type of design with the waist and shoulder options and the clippable strap. So those are two of my new favorite options. Check those out. You can head to janji.com and get 10% off any of those items as well as anything else they have on there by using promo code BITTER10 for 10% off. They're also available at REI. I will give one quick plug, although it's not winter or cooler. A couple other items that I have in my rotation when it does get cooler is the Repeat Merino long sleeve, the Rover Merino hoodie, the Trail Tights, and the Atlas multi-pant. I've been using Element electrolytes for quite some time now. Actually, a while back, I had a sweat test and it suggested that I lose 614 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid loss, meaning if I go out for a run and I sweat to the capacity where I lose a liter of fluid, I'm going to lose 614 milligrams of sodium along with that. So during these hot summer months, it's not uncommon that I will lose over a liter per hour when working out. So I favor adding some electrolytes to my workout fluids and pre-workout drinks in order to account for this. I also find it beneficial if I spend some time in the sauna and lose fluids fast that way. I currently have 3 approaches to using Element products. First is one of their warm beverage options in the morning with my coffee. Sometimes I'll put about half a pack of Element in there. Again, one of their warm beverage options. So usually that's something like chocolate mint, chocolate chai, chocolate raspberry, one of those. A second option is one of their fruity flavors in my water bottles while I'm training. So if I'm out there and I'm going through 16 to 20 ounce bottles of water, I'm going to sprinkle in some of that fruity Element flavors into that in order to account for that 614 milligrams of sodium that I'm going to lose. Third is their newest option, which is their Sparkle product, which is just a 16-ounce carbonated can with the Element electrolyte powder in it already mixed for you. So I've been using these for long runs and before afternoon training sessions in the gym when I know my fluid loss has been high. So I've been doing a lot of long runs lately, and having a can of Sparkle there to kind of sip at in between pit stops in the heat to cool down and rehydrate have been a great new addition to my training lineup. Just a reminder, their core flavors include citrus, watermelon, orange, grapefruit, raspberry, chocolate, mango chili, and chocolate caramel. Some seasonal options include chocolate mint, chocolate chai, and chocolate raspberry. You can go to drinklmnt.com/HPO. Throw in that /HPO and you'll get prompted for a free sample pack with your purchase, and help support the Human Performance Outliers podcast along the way. The reason I chose Delta G over other exogenous ketone supplements is they have the formula and the dosage that is supported by the research we have to date. They have the DARPA grant to design for special forces, 50 plus research studies, and 20 plus ongoing studies. They also have approximately 3 times the amount of ketones in their product than many of their competitors do, which can be critical for hitting the ketone target ranges that suggest potential cognitive and performance benefits. I've been playing around with my protocol a bit during this last training block, so it has changed a bit from what prior protocols you may have heard me mention on here. For like longer training sessions, these are going to be the key points that I'm going to do it. So it's going to be lower intensity but long in duration. I like the long runs. I like these for long runs and even ultra specific long runs, which tend to span beyond, say, 3 hours. And the way I will do this is I will take a bottle of Delta G Performance, that's the blue bottle they have on their website, about an hour into that training session. And then if that session goes beyond 3 hours, I will take a second one. If it doesn't, I will still take a second one post long run as a way to kind of kickstart things for whatever's coming up next. If you're interested in hearing more about it, I did record an episode with Brian McMahon. It's episode 351, Exogenous Ketones and Performance. And if you're also interested in checking more out about the product and signing up for a free consultation to find out how it would maybe fit your lifestyle, you can head to deltagketones.com. Feel free to throw in a promo code BITTER20 for 20% off your purchase of Delta G Ketones. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.